Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a new edition of our European Strategy Dialogue. We do the European Strategy Dialogue in cooperation between the Leiden University in the Netherlands, Sirice from Sorbonne in France, and the University of Bonn here in Germany. And we have done various editions on different topics like discussions in our states about national security strategies. We have discussed the issue of how did the Brexit affect European security policies, etc. So various issues over the last 2.5 years. Today, we are navigating the strategic connections between Europe and Asia. For sure, China is a very important player in this, but not the only one. We are also looking perhaps at the triangle between the interests of the US, Europe, and Asian countries, in particular also China. But again, it is not just about China, it is about the wider picture. And I'm very happy that you could join us for this European Strategy Dialogue. I'm very happy to have very prominent and good panelists, and I will hand over now to Jeroen Dobber, who will be the moderator for today's event. Thank you very much for coming in, and thank you for participating.
Yes, thank you very much, Dirk, and welcome also on my behalf. My name is Jeroen Dobber. I work for the Brussels office of the Friedrich-Naumann-Foundation, German political foundation. And I'm responsible here for the Global Security Hub, which is our expertise center to work on global security issues. In that capacity, I'm very happy to moderate the event today on this very timely topic. I must say, with all the ongoing developments in Israel and Palestine, it might be difficult to look further east on an evening like this. But it's a crucial theme as well. And during this event, we want to, as Dirk already mentioned, we want to discuss the strategic relations between Europe and Asia. How have the relations with Asian states evolved over the past few years? Where are they heading? And how should Europe adapt to the changing power dynamic? As Dirk already mentioned, we don't only, China is the most obvious player in all of this, and the experts that we have here joining us today are all very knowledgeable on that, but we don't want to make that the only topic, so we'll also look at other actors that play a role in the strategic relationship and other factors that we should consider. And in addition, we want to look at the transatlantic component. We'll soon start with the first round of opening questions to all the speakers. After that, it will be possible for the people in the audience to bring up questions as well. Please feel free to bring up your questions using the Q&A function. And then around 7:20, I'll start wrapping up so that we can end the event at 7:30. Latest. But apart from these practicalities, I want to, before we start the discussion, I want to briefly introduce the speakers that we have with us today. To begin, we have Frans-Paul van der Putten, Senior Research Associate at the Klingendahl Institute, and also an independent researcher and consultant on China and geopolitics. We have Alice Ekman, who's a senior analyst who's in charge of the Asia portfolio at the European Union Institute for Security Studies, EUISS, and Maximilian Meyer, who is a junior professor in international relations and global politics of technology at the University of Bonn. Welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for joining. Really happy that you could all make it. As I mentioned, I would like to kickstart or kick off the discussion with the first round of opening questions, and after that we can ask some follow-up questions. But I would like to bring in the questions from the audience as soon as they come up. And I'll start the round of the opening questions with Frans-Paul. and it's a broader, maybe you could kind of give a broader picture of the main kind of developments that have happened over the past years, or maybe over the past decades in specifically EU-China relations. Could you tell us a bit how they have developed in the past few years, and also from your point of view where they are heading?
Yes, thank you, Jeroen, for that question, and it's nice to be here to be part of this European strategic dialogue. So the relationship between the EU and China, the main developments in the past few years, I think there's two important developments that I would like to mention here. I think one important development is that on the European side, in the bilateral relationship, there has been a very strong increase in awareness that the relationship with China is much more complicated and also carries much more difficulties and risks than previously assumed. So I think past few years saw this rising awareness, and this rising awareness translated into a growing defensiveness on the EU side. So the EU is more cautious, more looking for vulnerabilities and how to address these vulnerabilities, not just vulnerabilities, but also in general risks for the European side. That's one important development. And the second one I want to mention is that the bilateral relationship between EU and China over the past few years has become less bilateral. It has become more embedded in great power relations. So whereas the major dynamics between EU and China used to be the EU and China, the two of them, now it's also the United States, also Russia, whose actions have a very big impact, and increasingly so, I think, on EU-China relations. So where is this going? In what direction? I would say increasing uncertainty, because there is less control. I mean, bilateral relations with China were complicated for a long time already, but it's become even more difficult, I think, for the EU to control that relationship. So less control and more uncertainty, and a greater need for a clear strategic aim. So to connect all these things. To give just one example, de-risking is an important, a major approach that the EU is using at the moment to reduce the risks that are there in the bilateral relationship. But unless you assume that de-risking means removing each and every risk, it probably means not reducing all risk, because that would imply probably ending the relationship altogether. Because I think as long as the EU has a relationship with China, there will be risks. So if that is the assumption, I think at the moment it's uncertain for the EU and also for other actors where this kind of defensive approach, this risk reducing approach by the EU, where it is going to. What is the bigger strategic direction there?
Thanks. Thanks very much for that. And perhaps we can talk a bit more in more detail about that, about the de-risking discussion later on, because that's something that you hear quite a lot now also in Brussels. And I'd be interested to hear more from you, but also from the other speakers, what you think about that. But before that, maybe I would like to turn to Alice to ask if you could give us a bit of a kind of a broader picture of the regional dynamics in which this is all taking place. How are those dynamics changing, and what role do the EU but also the US play in all of that?
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take part in this event. Usually when we look at the broader picture, we hear about a strategic triangle, right? We try to represent the world, especially following what Frans-Paul is saying, with great growing power, great power relationship and rapport de force. We try to summarize this rapport de force as a triangle with the US, the EU, or Europe, and China, basically. And I would like to take 5 minutes to say that, in my opinion, this representation of the world is misleading. We are not in a strategic triangle situation for several reasons. First of all, we have been witnessing a China-Russia rapprochement. And so there is no representative of Russia in this triangle. But if you consider that from an EU perspective, that Russia's behavior is an issue, and it is, that Russia in this context is seen as an enemy, as a country to sanction, then you would put China as, I would say, a point in that triangle as if there was no China-Russia rapprochement in the long term. I think this is misleading. According to me, I mean, the China-Russia relationship and the rapprochement has been underestimated over the last 10 years. When Russia turned east in 2014, following an annexation of Crimea, the common expression was a marriage of convenience. Remember? It was argued that Russia has no other option but to turn east, but this turn is pragmatic and limited in time because Russia is too much of a junior partner for China. The relationship is too unbalanced, and there is no deep down convergence between the two countries that would make the rapprochement long-lasting. But about 10 years later, this rapprochement is still ongoing, and I think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an unfortunate test of the bilateral rapprochement between China and Russia. China still to date has not condemned Russia's behavior. China is not using much of the term war. It uses a lot the term crisis or now Russia-Ukraine conflict, but sometimes also using special military operation following Russian discourse. And we have many evidence that the rapprochement is still going on. Looking at joint military exercise, including in Northeast Asia, and we go back to, to the regional dynamics, but also looking at the bilateral trade that has increased sharply in 2022 compared to 2021, plus 30% and more, regarding at export of technological components from China to Russia in recent months. Of course, China is not exporting arms so far, and we have no evidence of China exporting arms to Russia, but at also diplomatic level, there is a form of support. We can look at it from different frameworks, but including at BRICS. And overall, the rapprochement, according to me, is long-lasting. If it resists the test of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, means that they have more there is solid point of convergence that are not merely economic or energy, dominated, but it's also about geostrategic convergence in a long-term perspective, taking into account that they share a common enemy, which is the US and allies in general term. Maybe we have more time to elaborate on during the Q&A, but that's one point where, I think the strategic triangle is misleading because there is no positioning of Russia and the relationship between China and Russia in this current rapport de force, which is structuring. The second reason why I think this strategic triangle representation is a bit misleading is that, you have what we call now the global south. And China's coalition building strategy is targeting, is addressed to the global south, an expression that China is using too, by the way, now. To give you an example, the Global Security Initiative that China has launched more than a year ago, but which a white paper was published in February, mentioned Africa 14 times, but never Europe. The 5,000 traineeship opportunity that the Chinese government offer to military police officers in the next 5 years concern of military police officers of developing countries, also called the Global South. The coalition building dynamics that China has promoted at the UN is mainly gathering countries that are considered non-Western. The Belt Initiative also now is readjusted to target countries who are still open to the project and the initiative, and they are mainly located outside the EU, much outside of course, countries which are considered non-reliable partners from a Chinese perspective. So this is not to say that the EU or Europe is not an important market for China, but it's not seen as a long-term partner in Chinese eyes. So why I think it's important also to focus on, to analyze the rationale behind, to analyze the legitimacy of this strategic triangle legitimacy is because it has policy implication. From that triangle, you have then policy orientation indicating that some member states argue that we should promote a third way, or own our own way toward China. And often the policymakers, being President Macron or sometimes a European representative, they add that this does not mean equidistance between the US and China, of course, because we are allies of the US, but still finding our own way in this rapport de force, which would be dominated by two countries, the US and China. But as a matter of fact, we are facing not just a competition between two countries, but between increasingly groups of countries. Two groups of countries. It's not a fully bipolar world so far, but still you have a polarization of the world that is becoming clearer on a certain number of issues. And you can see voting patterns at the UN, but you can also see clearly which countries are endorsing an Indo-Pacific strategy and which country are condemning this term, which country are supporting Ukraine and which country are positioning themselves against sanctions, etc., towards Russia, etc. And a number of issues, and this is valid for COVID. This is valid for COVAX and the vaccination, the vaccine policy, and this may also, unfortunately, be valid to the war that we are witnessing in Israel. So, to be confirmed, but you have a polarization of the world on a certain number of crises and war. And this polarization of the world should be taken into account because not only on one side you have the alliance that is being reinforced, that is being enlarged in the framework of NATO, it's being consolidated to have a convergent position, coherent position at EU level and transatlantic level to support Ukraine, but also on the other side, you have China and other so-called friends who are also trying to coordinate their policy and their action to build what they see as an anti-Western front and an anti-Western dynamic and to voice their position and their interests stronger. It may appear a bit simplistic, but I prefer to simplify the word as a battle of coalition than as a strategic triangle that, according to me, is misleading, not just in terms of analysis, but in terms of policy decision.
Thanks, Alice. That was very useful, and I think a lot of ideas for the further discussion. I think the Russia-China angle, we should definitely discuss that more. Russia is one of those Asian powers that is perhaps not always on the radar as an Asian power, but it's very much so, and should also be considered in that light. Same with the global South, what you mentioned to also include those perspectives. So maybe we can do a short follow-up discussion later on. But thanks so much for that. Maximilian, then to kind of round up this kind of this tour, could you give us, if we have to put ourselves in kind of China's shoes, or if we look at the world from Beijing, could you give us a bit of an impression how the EU-Asia relations are seen from a Chinese point of view? How are they changing, and where is that heading?
Yeah, happy to shed some light on that. First of all, also glad to be here in this round. And I think it's increasingly important that we have more and more of these dialogues in Europe, because our China policy is badly fragmented and there's much need to be more coordinated. But back to Jeroen, to your question. So I think if we put ourselves into a Chinese shoes or into Chinese perspective, I think there are three main issues which are debated currently in China and which concern Chinese policymakers and experts. One is the security dimension of the relationship with Europe. The second one is the shift in economic relations. And the third one is Taiwan. And all of these are sort of pointing towards a more complicated, more conflictual relationship. And I will add, from my own perspective, all of them increasingly have certain misconceptions, mutual misconceptions, which are driving distrust and a conflictive relationship. So let's go in the first, so security dimension. There's a long discussion in China, and it has been ramping up recently on what is European autonomy, right? And Europe should be more autonomous. And of course, the key problem is here that the Chinese understanding of what European autonomy is supposed to be is pretty different from what we discuss here in Europe. From the Chinese point of view, it's mainly about being more autonomous from the US and being less dependent on the US. And Europe is very often seen in China as an appendix or as a vassal or even as a running dog, as some Chinese commentators like to say, Yogo, to describe the European position. So there's a total difference, obviously, from what we discuss in Europe. And Beijing hopes continuously and is pressing that Europe should become more autonomous towards the US. Why? Because China hopes Europe can take somehow a neutral or not fully US supportive position in the case of a conflict in Taiwan. And then, but that's only one element. The second element, the security dimension, has to do with the increased role of NATO in Asia Pacific and the perception from the Chinese side that European nations might become more involved in the Asia Pacific. Certainly, there's a difference between France and Germany in terms of capabilities, and that's clearly discussed in China and perceived in the sense that France has perhaps the potential to be more genuine autonomous than Germany. Germany is seen as basically just an instrument or tool of US foreign policy. And then the other, I think, factor which is less relevant from a Chinese point of view, but very relevant from a European point of view, is, of course, Chinese role in Ukraine's war. That is not so much discussed in China, but it's brought up, of course, by a lot of European diplomats and Europeans going to China. And the Chinese point of view still is here unchanged, basically, since the beginning of the war. This is not our war. We are neutral. This is not our thing. You have to resolve this thing in Europe, and we can contribute to peace or to somehow a stabilization and end of the conflict, but it's your problem. It's not our problem. And of course, this is also a big misconception on the Chinese side, because from the European side, this is absolute priority, and the increasing distrust of Europe towards China is mainly driven by Chinese position or non-position towards the war, and by the European hope that China could not only perhaps be more taking a mediator role and pushing Russia to end the war, but also not delivering weapons or parts and so forth. And this kind of development, that the loss of trust and you could say the collapse of trust into China on the European side, that's still not very well understood and received on the Chinese side. And then going to the economy really quickly, I think the whole de-risking debate is going on in China, and critique against Europe in terms of and hope that Europe could define what it means by de-risking and clarify, and what is the difference of de-risking and decoupling. And quite recently, especially the European Commission's investigation into subsidies in the car industry and the is an issue in China, and of course that's seen very negatively. It has been called protectionist and is seen as a measure against Chinese car companies. And China is, I think, already preparing countermeasures depending on the possible outcome of these investigations. On the other hand, it's very well acknowledged on the Chinese side that a lot of European companies continue or go back to invest in China, especially German companies. And that's seen as sort of voting by foot, that maybe the de-risking is more on the level of rhetoric, but on the actual level of investment decisions. And I'm referring here to the Chinese debate, right? That's not my view, obviously, but that's what is discussed in China. On the level of investment, especially German investments, that's seen as still a sign of confidence into the Chinese market. Yeah, and last but not least, the Taiwan issue. I think there's a debate in China and increasingly negative perception, not of the European position in general, but of what some smaller European states, especially in Eastern Europe and the Baltic states, are, from a Chinese point of view, trying to create alliances of like-minded democracies and trying to maybe even move towards acknowledging Taiwanese sovereignty to some degree, at least not de jure, but maybe in practice. And that is a increasing concern in Beijing, that this might also impact the larger European-Chinese relationship. So this is a wrap-up. And I think in all these three elements, you see increasingly that there are misconceptions on both sides, which are not well mitigated and not well managed. And therefore, the relationship, I think, is increasingly losing a stable basis. So we are building more and more on a shifting ground, and that's making it, given the Chinese-American conflict, I think increasingly conflictual and problematic, also to predict what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. I think that's a very important perspective to have here. And those misconceptions, I would also like to discuss that later on. Taiwan will probably bring up if we have enough time. So thanks for that overview. I see there is already one question in the Q&A, but before I ask that, I wanted to do one follow-up question. It's a broader one. I'll start with Frans-Paul, but the others can chip in as well if they want to. It's about the EU relations with China. So that is defined at the moment as so China is a partner for cooperation and negotiation, economic competitor, and a systemic rival. So kind of quite clear categories, but it's not entirely clear how that relates to different policy areas. So how is that reflected in trade, in investments, in technology, in security, and climate? It seems to be a mix of all of those actually in all of those policy domains. Frans-Paul, where in what areas do you think, from your point of view, is China a partner? In what areas is it a competitor, and in what areas is it a systemic rival?
Yeah, I think it's a very descriptive approach to the relationship that was introduced in 2019, and I think that shows, the development of the awareness on the European side that the Chinese relationship with China is a complicated one. Yeah, about your question, I'm not sure. I find it difficult to put it into categories. At first glance, you might be tempted to think that, okay, the economic relationship applies mostly to cooperation and competition. But I think also there, one of the difficulties in the economic relationship with China is also this systemic dimension, the fact that China just has a very different political economic model than the European Union. So I think the reason why it's so difficult to answer your question is that in the end it's up to us to choose how to translate this descriptive analysis into an understanding of China, a functional understanding that makes clear how we want to position ourselves with regard to China. So it's also a question for us as a European Union. Do we ultimately think that we can coexist with China even if it maintains the political economic system that it has at the moment? Or is this not possible? And I think it's not a matter of just China's behavior, but it's also a matter for us to decide how we want to continue.
Thanks, Maximilian. I see you unmuted yourself. Do you have some thoughts on that as well?
Happy to chip in there. I think, one element of this discussion is, of course, this notion of the new Cold War or second Cold War, right? And the question how much European policymakers, and we have to think here about two levels, the European Union level, but more importantly, perhaps here, the level of the member states, how much they subscribe already to this kind of notion. And then even within countries, different sectors, the industry, policymakers, maybe others, let's say telecommunication, for example, as a sector. How much is the subscription to this notion leading to real change? And there's quite some astonishing differences in Europe. For example, take 5G. France and others have a much lower 5G dependency on Huawei than Germany has. And so there's a past dependency in that, and therefore the strategic room for maneuver is not as big for Germany in that case as for France and others to reduce dependencies, which would be in line with a new Cold War approach. That's one thing. The second thing I think is US pressure, and the pressure to align with US policy interests. And there is a lot of things happening in the last couple of months, right? Just recently, last week, the European Commission came out with a new screening concept for technology exports, and that follows more or less 100% to what the US has been doing in the last half year, especially if you look at the types of technologies which are to be protected in the sense that they are not supposed to be exported to China. So there's a lot of alignment here going on. And we have to see, of course, again, on the level of member states, how is that implemented? By which kind of mechanisms, and how strictly will that be policed and controlled and monitored? So this is, I think, this is a very fragmented picture. I agree here with Frans-Paul. It's not a grand approach. It's more like different in different fields. And maybe we take one other example, the example of renewable energy technologies and everything we need for a fast and cheap energy transition in Europe. We are heavily depending on Chinese products and on Chinese services. And it's basically impossible to decarbonize Europe without Chinese products. So if that's true, then there is there's conflicting goals, right? If you want to do more de-risking in this field, then you cannot achieve decarbonization. If you want to stick with decarbonization, you have to exempt the whole area of technologies from de-risking, right? And that's the kind of difficulties policymakers are facing, and it's really tough choices. And therefore, it can be expected that we don't have a massive policy shift just overnight, but we have really an attempt and more sort of a fragmented policy making in terms of different sectors, in terms of different technologies, and that's not going to change. So I think we will move forward with that unless and until there might be a conflict in Taiwan and we might have more general sanctions, right? Then we have a different game. But so far we are not in that game, and therefore we see quite difficulties to grasp with that problem.
Yeah. So it's kind of like a slow evolution, not necessarily like a very strategic process. Also, if I understand it well, in the sense that it's all done on a kind of case by case basis, if you will. Yeah. Alice, did you have any further thoughts on this question, on that kind of EU-China relationship?
Yeah, on the triptych, partner, competitor, rival, it's, of course, we have to analyze that there is a recalibration of the triptych, which is still, referred to, but recalibration with an emphasis on strategic and systemic rivalry, which was pretty, I think, visible in von der Leyen's speech before she visited China, but also in recent declaration and communication. And there's a lot of comment about systemic rivalry, and Chinese analysts themselves have rejected strongly the idea and the notion. We have several think tankers who have wrote about it and made it public. It's been commented that European counterparts are asked about the meaning of systemic rivalry. As an analyst focusing a lot on China, my view is that China sees us as systemic rival before we saw them, and you saw them. So I saw China as systemic rival. As you know, Xi Jinping in 2013 talked about superiority of socialism over capitalism and the ultimate victory of socialism over capitalism. Whatever you put behind these two labels, and whatever far from the ideal of that this label are referring to, is he shaped the relationship as a rivalry between systems. and a system that should win over the other. And you may think this is just communication. Well, no, this speech was made closed door, first of all, in front of party cadres. Second, you have also evidence in speeches, but also in position that China sees the West in general as a rival. Because as you know, for China, the priority is political security. Right, is a top priority. And to ensure political security, the Communist Party of China think that not only now China should fight against hostile forces on its territory, being Western hostile forces or traitors for the inside, but also to fight back at international level so that China will not be, I would say, weakened by foreign interference so much. And this is pretty visible, for example, in the joint statement and declaration that Xi Jinping and Daniel put forward in the visit of Xi Jinping to Moscow in March 2023. They said that they will jointly work together to fight color revolution across the globe. I quote by memory, but they were clear about fighting jointly against color revolution. You may think this is the statement, but again, when you read closely Chinese declaration, when you listen to position, you analyze position and declaration from spokesperson, but also from Sichuan, etc., there is a clear vision of the world which is seen as the West has been fomenting, political trouble across the world, from Hong Kong to Ukraine to Syria to the Arab Spring, etc. The general perception is that the CIA is behind everything, actually, deep down. Of course, it's not presented as this, but you have a nearly conspirationist view of the world, which consider that the West is interfering far too much. That is not indigenous, disappointment or dissatisfaction, but it's just a manipulation from Western hostile forces. And it is time to fight back and to fight against the West through different means. So converging propaganda and disinformation strategies, but also these coalition building strategies that we've been mentioning before, but also in the term of model promotion. I think China is pretty explicit about the fact that it wants to position itself as an example to follow to part of the world, not to the developing world or the global south. Wang Yi clearly stated that China is an example of modernization to the world that other countries can learn from China. Actually, Chinese diplomacy have been saying that for more than 10 years, but it's more persistent now. It's clearer in the discourse, but also in its following action. We mentioned training programs earlier, but there is also global governance, I would say, strategy in terms of forum building, multilateral conferences and institutions being promoted or enlarged, such as the BRICS, but also you have a third Belt and Road Forum to take place shortly in Beijing. You have Xiangshan Forum. You have all these dynamics that should not be underestimated. My view is that for too long we've been underestimating China's capabilities, diplomatic capabilities, innovation capabilities, etc. I think really the promotion of China's interest, I mean, from our European perspective, we tend to, because in Europe, the image of China has eroded and the influence of China, I would say it's contained based on the assessment of the hardening of China's domestic and foreign policy. Our conclusion or our view is that globally, China is not managing to promote its interest or its image, but there is a big contrast, in other parts of the world where Chinese initiative and image is still very much seen from a positive light. So I think the systemic rivalry is something to take seriously on both sides. Europe increasingly sees China as a systemic rival, partly due to human rights issue, Xinjiang, and other issues of sensitivities, I think, from China. But from China, European countries as democracies, but also as allies of the US, are seen as systemic rival from the beginning, from the beginning of Xi Jinping's mandate. And I would like to add that also China sees us as systemic rival, just because the fact that most of EU member states are NATO members, Japan, our liaison office in Japan or not, we are we are NATO members, and as such, it is an issue for China, and also due to the fact that most countries and at EU levels there is an adoption of Indo-Pacific strategy. That Wang Yi mentioned clearly. I mean, I quote by heart again, but he said the US-led Indo-Pacific strategies are illegitimate. They are a new form of NATO in Asia, and they are doomed to fail. That we want it or not, you have this hostile view of Indo-Pacific strategies, even if they are shaped differently, if they take different format, different geographic scope. And China considers that everything or every initiative that is reinforcing cooperation or coordination among allies is negative and should be pushed back. And I think that's just the beginning of China's pushback, but it will not be, I would say, easy from China's side. But China clearly has taken a stronger stance to support North Korea at the UN, along with Russia before the summer. China has been quite critical about, porous Korea-US recent cooperation, about Japan new security strategy, and will reach out to other countries to try to marginalize the West. We are far from that, but it's interesting to notice that you have this systemic rivalry that is seen as both domestic politics level, but also geostrategic level from Beijing view.
Thanks a lot, Alice. Very important points. I would like to continue now with the first question that came in from the audience, and I would like to split that up in two questions. It's quite a long question. The first question is: do you think it's dangerous that the debate always evolves around the strategic triangle, US, it says US, UK, China, but I think maybe we can go a bit more into what Alice mentioned earlier, this US, EU, China triangle. I would be interested to hear the views of Maximilian and Frans-Paul on that as well. And after that, Alice, there's another question. Why are Japan and South Korea, who share our values and who are very committed to an institutionalized and rule-based world order, not addressed more as our strong economic partners and friends? Are we missing out on opportunities there? Maybe we can, as a second question, I will bring that up with you. But maybe first, I would like to ask then Maximilian and Frans-Paul. Maximilian, you first. What do you think about that strategic triangle, and if that is perhaps dangerous to always debate it in that context?
Well, so my view on that is I don't feel we are overestimating the triangle, because we're also talking about other dimensions, right? So I don't see in our discourse that we're focusing on EU, China, US triangle only. What we're certainly missing in our perception is the global south that has been already mentioned. So it's not just, as Alice said, that China has increasing soft power and is providing a lot of public goods, where we have largely failed in the last 20 years. So Belt and Road is just one element of that, and that's going on. But it's also the aspirations in the global south of changing the global system and having more vote and more voice. And therefore, what happened in New Delhi with the G20 to include the African Union, I think is extremely important move. As an example, that also with the support of Europe and the US, African countries can have a bigger voice. So that's very important. I think it's coming very late. It's too late, but still now than never. So the role of the global south is very important, and then the role of India is very important, right? How much is Europe doing to support India in the international system to have a stronger voice? Of course, there is also reservations towards India for good reasons, because the Indian government is moving ideologically and what they do in India into a very problematic direction. So it's not such a natural choice, and that's different with Japan and I think South Korea. Here we could do more from Europe. Especially what we are not doing is this kind of minilateral development and minilateral collaboration. Most recently, the meeting between the German Chancellor and the heads of states of Central Asia is an example for this kind of minilateral format. I was wondering, why is there not Italy? Why is there not France? Why is there not Poland on the table? Why is it just Germany alone? So it's certainly a mistake to do this one European country, and some other countries who should do more collaborations. Also could include, for example, Israel, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and others. And this kind of minilateral space is becoming more important because all of the middle and smaller countries which have a considerable technological base are increasingly under pressure from both China and the US to align with certain policies, to not import or export certain technologies, and it's impacting the economic development of these actors. So these actors have a natural interest to collaborate more on a minilateral basis. And so I think there's much more potential and opportunities, and we see some things emerging, but that could be done much more forcefully. And maybe a last point before giving over to Frans-Paul, I think the European Union has been caught by surprise by two really major developments in that field. One is the Abraham Accords, especially Germany, but also other European actors were totally behind in this development and are still not participating strongly enough in that trend. And we will see how the Abraham Accords and the whole group of countries will be impacted, of course, by the war now in Israel and the coming military operation in Gaza. The second example is the Japanese South Korean rapprochement. And that was orchestrated by the US strongly. And we don't know how stable it is, especially if there might be a change of government in Korea. However, Europe could use that opportunity to join much more closely with both of these countries. Germany has unduly, I think, focused on Japan and not much enough focused on South Korea. And again, moving towards minilateral formats would be really making a lot of sense here.
Yeah, regarding the strategic triangle, I agree with the statement that Alice made earlier, where she pointed out that it's not a matter of three actors because there are so many more actors and factors that play a role, and there's a danger of looking at the geopolitical landscape from the perspective of a strategic triangle that involves the EU. That the danger is that the EU overestimates its role and underestimates the role of others. My understanding of the global geopolitical landscape is that there's a dynamic between the US and China, which is a central dynamic, and US and China are the main players. And then you have a lot of different actors. Among one of that big group is the EU. Of course, it's a very diverse group, but the EU shares with Russia and Japan and India and South Korea and many others that we are very, very much influenced by what is happening between US and China. And we don't have so much influence ourselves on that important dynamic. So with regard to the second part of the question, I would say with South Korea and Japan, to some extent, they're in a similar position as the EU, and therefore, yes, it would, it makes a lot of sense for the EU to focus its attention on understanding their position and also on strengthening the coordination with those countries.
Thanks for that, and thanks for already leading also into that second part of the question.
Can I add a two-finger here? So,
of course.
I think just totally agreeing with Frans-Paul here, and adding to that, I think it's not only US-China, the bilateral relations, it's also the strategic decision of US governments already since maybe 2 administrations to retreat to some degree from certain regions in the world, especially the Middle East, West Asia, and Europe. And that retreat is now, because of the Ukraine war, just seems to be not so strong or not so clear. But this retreat is going to happening more with whoever is being the next government in the US, especially if it's a Republican government. So that kind of retreat is creating power vacuums and is creating more space for regional actors. And here, the European Union, with its notorious lack of hard power, is in a specifically precarious situation. And let's just assume that Trump is becoming president for a moment and would stop the military support to Ukraine, then it would fall to the European NATO allies only to support Ukraine in this war. And are we capable of, are we willing, are we prepared doing that? And I think this is an example for this larger dynamic of a US retreat from certain regions, West Africa, certain parts of Africa, West Asia, certain parts of Africa, Europe, not East Asia, of course, not Asia Pacific, there's a difference. And this is another dynamic which is somehow related to the China-US bilateral dynamic, but it's also a larger decision of the US to be less present in these regions, and the regions are adapting to that and are responding to that. And the question is, for Europe especially, it's maybe even a matter of survival in the future. If we don't respond with stronger hard power and be able to defend ourselves, Europe will be in a much more weaker and much more problematic position in 10 years and 15 years from now.
Thanks for adding that, and perhaps we can talk a bit more about that later as well. The US, the US dynamic in all of this. But before that, I wanted to quickly turn to Alice to ask about your take on the second question. I know that you work on the 1.5 track dialogues of with the EU's partners in Asia. Could you give us a bit of an idea of what is going on there already, also in terms of those partnerships with from the EU point of view? And indeed, do you think we're missing out on certain opportunities there?
Well, yeah, we have track 1.5 with both South Korea and Japan, and EUISF is not the only one to conduct such a dialogue, but without going too much in the detail of this closed door exchange, I must say that you have a really expectation from both Japan and South Korea to reinforce cooperation with Europe, partly due to what Maximilian says also about sometimes, the after effect of Trump administration, the reconsideration of ties, the worries that comes out with the potential change of administration, upcoming administration, and the fact also that they've been also feeling the pressure of the US when it comes to shaping their China policy. Of course, there are different views according to different governments. The current South Korean government is a bit, it's reinforcing cooperation with the US, which is a difference from the previous one, but overall you have the impression, and I think that's also why Japan has a new security strategy and increases defense budget significantly, is that you also have to reinforce your own defense capabilities in case your main allies and partners are not always able to support you for various reasons, being administration change or overstretch. Of course, the US is very much supporting its allies in the region, and the alliance is, is structural for both South Korea and Japan, but they believe that reinforcing ties with Europe is also key in this great power dynamics, and you have a lot of dialogues and cooperation, project in various fields. You have a EU-Japan connectivity agreement that has been signed 5 years ago, and that is progressively taking into shape. You have cooperation with South Korea on various issues, including cyber security, countering disinformation. You have also strategic discussion on the regional threat, on the Indo-Pacific, and also you have a lot of discussion about the so-called intertwining between conflict theater, between Asia and Europe, and actually that's relating to our discussion tonight, with Japan, strongly condemning Russia's behavior, adjusting its position, adopting sanctions, and ROK also calling the same path. You have a view that we are on the same boat, that both conflict theater are interconnected, and of course you have this frequent question about the impact in Asia, and particularly in the Taiwan Strait. And there you have the different analysis, I think, also between partners, but also between the partner that we just mentioned and the US. And I think also why these ties, EU, Japan, EU, South Korea, and others are reinforcing is also because you have a set of tension with the US, including transatlantic tension. And that may explain why sometimes there is discussion about the third way or, own way, because there is a feel of pressure from the US to have, to really follow the same line as US when it comes to Chinese technologies, for instance. It doesn't mean that there are divergent analysis, but the fact that sometimes some EU policymakers feel that they don't have the full space to shape their own China policy, which can be partly true, partly wrong, but this is a feeling or perception part of the policy-making apparatus. So that leads to sometimes, a push for this concept and maybe more like, I would say, an orthodox positioning during visits to China. But transatlantic tension, I think we should spend a minute on this because they need to be, I think, underlined, because they are remaining, Inflation Reduction Act has seen quite negatively in many parts of Europe. Already during Trump administration, the adoption of a phase one deal without informing European allies had been seen as an issue by some EU policymakers. More recently, some member states like France were, of course, disappointed by the signature of AUKUS, and I can list, there is a long list of points of divergences that aggregates and that leads to, I would say, a reinforcement of the alliance, but at the same time, constant, tension that leads to difficulty to shape a converging policy toward China. In the end, the policy is converging because the analysis, the preliminary analysis is converging. I think both the EU and the US are clear-eyed about the recent development in China. But still, I believe it's important in this existing alliance, which is structuring, to maybe reinforce, as Maximilian and Frans-Paul said, also reinforce cooperation and discussion at various levels, mini multilateral level, so that I would say also you have adjustment within among the alliance about which interests and which priority are taken into account when shaping the China policy, and that may also lead to another type of dynamic when discussing the geographical scope of NATO and also the orientation of the Indo-Pacific strategy. But overall, I still believe that we are in a competition between coalition, and that it's only by joining forces. For example, recent connectivity project between from Middle East up to Europe, it can be criticized, but it's an example of joining forces between transatlantic forces to build a common project that may be also in the interest of everyone. Actually, the main point of transatlantic tension is extraterritorial implementation of US law. Is related to different interests in terms of different economic and commercial interests. It's also again related to Inflation Reduction Act and Phase One deal, but only to say that of course you will always have diverging interests among countries, but among allies maybe the economic and commercial divergences should not put into parentheses should not be a downside or an issue when shaping a common geostrategic approach. I know it's complicated, but it's a long way to go. But that's basically the different diverging interests in front of coalition building strategies.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Alice. Maximilian, you unmuted yourself. You have something to add?
Maybe just take an example of what Alice was saying of this mutual accommodation in the strategic relationship between Europe and US. The de-risking discourse is a good example for that, right? Because the US started out with a much more like a discourse which was using decoupling and other notions, and then the European Commission brought in, and it hasn't invented the concept, but it has used the concept and popularized it. The idea of de-risking, and the American side has used that, and it's now the common policy lingo to describe that. And that's already an example for this mutual accommodation. And I think both sides also agreed that there is no general technological or trade decoupling from China, but there's a smaller, like the American small yard, high fence approach. And the Europeans have been following that because the US also shifted in its policy language. So this is an example for actually a successful kind of mutual difficult, but in the end successful way of having the same language. Whether the entire approach is making sense, that's a different question, right? And whether we are using the de-risking language is really helping us in our communication with China, I doubt that very much. I think we need different kind of language. And there is perhaps one big misunderstanding between the US and Europe, and not so much between Europe and China, because Europe and China are both still talking, at least rhetorically, about World Trade Organization models and frameworks. Whereas the US has made it very clear that there won't be any kind of trade agreement or any kind of investment agreement along the lines of a World Trade Organization model, because according to the US view, it has failed, and something which failed shouldn't be reproduced. And the Europeans still asking the US, when can we do finally our trade agreement? And so there's a much bigger gap in perception about the instruments for trade policy and future trade policy, and how to deal with subsidies and how to deal with that between the US and the European Union and some member states, as between Europeans and China, because they seem to, at least on the rhetorical level, still going in a different direction. And I think the Europeans, we really have to do our homework here. We are lacking a set of instruments which for industrial and trade policy, which goes beyond the World Trade model, World Trade Organization model. We don't have that. There are good reasons for why we don't have it, but I think we are in a different world now with a much stronger connection between security and economy, and we can no longer use these kind of outdated models. They not be very helpful. And perhaps one way forward is to have a much more open dialogue with China about not fair trade rules and about reciprocity and so forth, but simply saying, in some areas, we feel we are too much dependent on you. We are unhealthily dependent. As you feel, maybe you are too much unhealthily dependent on other actors. So let's negotiate how we can drive down these dependencies to a level which is acceptable and legitimate in our point of view. And we don't need the de-risking discourse for that. We really don't need that. We can actually just start negotiating. Take an example, the EV market, right? We could start now and talk with China. Okay, you can enter the EV market in Europe. However, we don't allow a greater share than European car companies, for example, have in the Chinese car market, which would be now around 35% or something in that dimension. So that would be, for me, a much more pragmatic, productive approach forward, instead of talking about unfair, non-fair, and whatever non-transparent subsidies, because not it's wrong, but we are beyond this kind of world. We are now in a different world, and we lack the set of instruments to be active and be productively dealing with China and with the US in this kind of new security economic nexus we are facing.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. So Europe kind of setting the terms, if I understand you correctly, and a much more pragmatic approach to that then, or yeah. Thanks. And in the meantime, I would like to encourage the people in the audience, if you would still like to ask a question, we have enough time to answer one or two more. So please feel free to do so. We have brilliant experts on board today. So this is a great opportunity to ask them everything you've always wanted to ask about EU-Asia relations. In the meantime, I do have one other follow-up question myself, and that is about, I think Alice said it, to join forces transatlantically, but I think it would be interesting to also zoom in a bit on Europe and the joining forces with us. I'm sorry if there's background noise, by the way. Somebody is hoovering in an office behind me, so I hope it's not too disturbing. Okay. So to zoom in a bit, also in the countries where you are based, to get a bit of an idea how this EU-China or EU-Asia relations discussion is taking place with you. How much is that in line with the broader discussions at the EU level? Where's there convergence and where's there divergence? Perhaps you could give a bit of. Some of you dropped a few hints on that already. Maybe Maximilian, you already mentioned a few times the kind of German approach to this. Could you expand a bit more on that? What is the German discussion on this topic at the moment, and where does it diverge from the EU positions, or where is there a strong convergence?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, I think in the German case, we have a bifurcation. We have on the rhetorical level, as represented by the new China strategy and other discussions, especially from foreign ministry, we have a much stronger emphasis. I think, as Alice made it clear, on the systemic rival dimension of the relationship with China and human rights. And the foreign minister made a couple of really strong statements, which were also criticized by a lot of people in Germany. That's the one side. On the other hand, we have German industries, German companies and investors, maybe somehow also the chancellery to a certain degree, which is less hawkish, which is less geopolitical, which still thinks mainly in economic terms and sees China still as an opportunity. Some of the bigger German companies have invested a lot recently, right? So surprisingly, perhaps to some, this has driven up the numbers and not driven down. In terms of overall investment. Of course, many companies are also moving out of the Chinese market, German companies for various reasons. And there's maybe overall a more critical, skeptical discourse, but still you have this bifurcation, right? You have stronger rhetoric, which is seeing China critical and is looking for the geopolitical, geoeconomic risks. On the other hand, you have economic actors, including big companies, who are still investing a lot in China and actually almost doubling down, right? So in that creates also a sort of I wouldn't say tension, but a nuance between what the European Commission is saying and what the Chancellery, for example, is saying. And so there's certainly space in between these different positions. And for the German economy, perhaps more than any other European economy, it is really a fundamental question whether some of the major German sectors are trying to be less depending on China, be it on imports from China, being on production in China, or being in terms of revenue of companies. That's a much harder decision than in other European countries. Again, go back to 5G. Germany has now, according to official statements by the telecom, we have 60% 5G from Huawei. If I'm not misinformed, France has around 18%. Take South Korea. South Korea has just 10% 5G from Huawei, right? And even that is now supposed to be more reduced according to the goals of the South Korean government. So you wonder here, there need to be some strategic decisions made. And so far, Germany has decided to rely stronger on China. And despite all the rhetoric, if you look at what has been done and what has been achieved in terms of dependence, not much has actually changed, right? And I think this is a reality, whatever certain politicians are saying and whatever the statements are doing. And that's a reality we have to see also what's the impact on the rest of Europe of that kind of decisions taken, or rather maybe non-decisions in terms of reducing dependencies on Chinese products.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. That's a very clear reality check, if you will. Alice, how does that discussion look like or what does that look like in France at the moment? Could you give us an insight?
Working at EU ISAP, I usually comment orientation at EU level, but I can make a small exception first. But before, I would like to say that you have more convergence than divergences among EU member states since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This is not diplomatic. No, I'm not just saying this because I work for an EU agency. It's just visible. Especially from perception of Central and Eastern European countries toward China has changed quickly over the last year and a half. It has already changed before Russia's invasion of Ukraine for economic reason. 16+1 or 7+1 expected more Chinese investment, being in the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative or others, but they were not satisfied with the level of investment overall. Then, of course, you had the case of Lithuania and the strong sanction launched by China targeting the country, which generated, of course, a reaction from not just Lithuania, but Baltic states who withdrew step by step from 16+1 framework. And overall, yeah, you have the perception that China is increasingly, or you have divergence among member states about, on analysis of the China-Russia relation, but overall there is a perception that China is not doing enough to condemn. It is not condemning the war, and it should do. And China has not, pressured Russia in any way, and there will be much more expectation. And initially, there was a economic rationale behind an expectation. At the penultimate EU-China summit, for instance, that given the importance of trade partnership between EU and China would have interest to adjust its position toward Russia, just for economic interest, just to keep good relations with significant trade partner that is the EU, but it did not. So the economic rationality that leads us to anticipation expectation is often misleading. And again, China and Russia have a geostrategic objective and political objective that goes beyond mere economic interest. Although the economic interests are there, but they are not as strong as economic interest China has on the EU market. But to go back to your question, as you know, the visit of Macron to China has been commented widely, so I will not add comment on comment, but I would say that for a long time in France there was a willingness to push, to shape an Asia or China policy at EU level. France was a few years ago, one of the countries along with Italy and Germany who pushed for the adoption at EU level of investment screening mechanism. France also pushed for a strategic discussion at EU level of more than 7 years ago on connectivity, leading to issuance of a connectivity plan to link Asia and Europe, which was the ancestor of the global gateway strategy that we know now and still need to be implemented. But you have a strong, I think, willingness from French diplomacy to act at EU level, but of course you have divergences. You have clear divergences. I would say attribute that divergences to also different nature of relationship with the US, of some EU member states with the US, and also different maybe analysis of the China-Russia rapprochement. But I would say that in France now, I think the discussion has not really shifted. China is, there is, I think, full awareness of the political system, the challenges that China is posing, the lack of level playing field, the lack of reciprocity. This has been a long topic of discussion, but still very much on the agenda table, and so I expect even in the future a bit more convergence among EU member states, and I would say the presidential trip to China has fueled an interesting discussion among EU member states at EU level that will also be conducive, I think, to a more coherent and a more convergent China policy at EU level. Well, that's my hope.
Thank you very much, Alice. And then coming from a trading nation, Frans-Paul, how is this being discussed in the Netherlands, and how does it relate with EU or EU discussions?
Yeah, I think it's largely the Dutch development and views and discussion are largely parallel to the EU level. And if you also put this in a broader context of Asia, the Netherlands has the China strategy and also an Asia strategy, which is called Indo-Pacific strategy. And so there's also some other member states who have this, and also you have this at the EU level. And this is I think this shows that there's a very strong focus on China. So even the reason why there is an Asia strategy and the content of the Asian strategy is also very much driven by the assessment that China is so important. So now there's the idea of the need to diversify relations. So not to focus economic and diplomatic relations too much on China, but to diversify away from China to other Asian countries. So it is in this context that the Dutch Indo-Pacific strategy was created. This was one of the reasons, I think. It's reactive. So it's reacting still to China very much. It's not focusing on the inherent importance of Asia as a region for the Netherlands, and I think to some extent this might apply also to the EU level. I think there are in particular two issues that I want to mention. One is the idea of diversifying the economic relationship away from China, so not to be too economically dependent just on China, but at the same time diversifying away to other countries in Asia, East Asia and Southeast Asia, which themselves are very, very closely connected to China. So if you look at the bigger picture, I think the big trend is that Asia is going to be going to remain and be ever more important economically for the whole world and also for the EU. Having indirect relations with China through other countries, through other Asian countries, still means that we are still going to be connected to China. We're still going to be, to some extent, dependent economically on China. And another thing I wanted to mention is at least the Dutch Indo-Pacific strategy, to me, doesn't seem to acknowledge the geopolitical connectiveness between various regions. So there is a growing risk of spillover of geopolitical tensions between regions. As tensions rise in Asia, they can spill over to Europe and to destabilize the regional order in Europe, and the other way around can also occur. And I think also this aspect, so besides the China-focused reactive aspect, I think also the awareness that there's much more to Asia than just trying to become less dependent on China, but also very much the geopolitical tensions between the US and China, and that are manifesting themselves in Asia, and that then can spill over into Europe. I think this is another aspect.
Thanks very much for that. I think that's important to understand also how within member states how these discussions are going, because that is part of the complexity for coming up with an EU strategy to deal with the future of EU-China relations. I have one more question about Maximilian just brought it up about the development of certain policy instruments. But I wondered this. We spoke a bit now about we spoke about de-risking. Also, I heard investment screening. There was a hint at the kind of military presence. There are all sorts of options for the EU to further develop some kind of policy instruments or to further create more ability to act in these EU-Asia relations. But what, in your opinion, it's an open question to all speakers. What, in your opinion, are policy instruments that we should look into much more closely, and what we should develop more if we want to develop like a policy toolkit with which we can have ability to act, strategic autonomy, open strategic autonomy, whatever you want to call it, but more of a European say in the future of EU-Asia relations. Are there any that you can think of, and if so, what would they be? Any takers for the first? Alice, yes.
I mean, it's pretty obvious, and this is going on, but stronger defense capabilities, that's a basic step for strategic autonomy. You know, from intelligence to proper, you know, equipments and no, so that there is a, you know, awareness at EU level, and there is, of course, you know, it's an ongoing process among member states, but it will take time, and you have some member states also preferring to cooperate with non-member states for understandable reason. You know, some countries like South Korea, who are armed providers to member states, and that's not an issue per se, but overall you need to have a more coherent, you know, defense package, defense strategy and policy, and that's also how it will be respected as a strong EU. And then also you have an anti-coercion mechanism that has been shaped following the, you know, sanction targeting Lithuania. You have a different mechanism like investigation process that have been mentioned by Ursula von der Leyen. All this will take time, but I think we are in a really, you know, hard time with multiplication of war, unfortunately, from one continent to one region to another. So it's often said that it's you know, when you facing crisis and or more than that it is you know, waking up and being more efficient. So it has shown efficiency when responding, you know, adopting common sanction packages targeting Russia. And I think also it will build up its military capabilities, defense capabilities, following the ongoing war and context and crisis.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. We'll put it on our wish list. Maximilian, Frans-Paul, do you have anything to other ideas, or would you like to add something to this?
I mean, Christmas is still not so soon coming, but on the other hand, it's sooner than we think. So I think building on what Alice said, I think the anti-economic coercion measure should be actually extended, not just for European countries, but also for other small countries. So the European Union should lend a hand there for other countries, like the US is doing. And there is actually something like that between the US, South Korea, and Japan already going on for helping other countries in Asia. So the European Union could perhaps support that mechanism. That might be even acting as or functioning as a deterrent against Chinese economic coercion. So this is, I think, a new, as far as I know, the European Union doesn't do that so far. But there might be something happening behind the curtain. We don't know. But this would be one element. And then the other element is, of course, not just the hard power we need. It's clear we need much more hard power. And this is a debate for itself, how to do that and what elements, from nuclear to conventional to drones and so forth. But it's also something about defense exports. So the European Union could, and of course that's European companies, could actually export more weapons to like-minded countries in Asia, right? To help them being in a stronger defensive position, for example, Indonesia, for example, the Philippines, but of course also countries like Singapore, Vietnam, and others, and in India, to be in a stronger defensive position vis-a-vis China. And then I think another element is the infrastructure and corridor building. Alice also mentioned that already, the new corridor idea. I think here it's very important also to have instruments which are not just in a way, not cementing, but tending towards more pushing the new Cold War. But I think we need also instruments which are really emphasizing the collaborative elements with China. And here the Global Gateway could do actually much more to link up with Belt and Road projects and to try to have some bigger collaboration on some of these projects. I think that's possible, especially since the Chinese side, as another convergence, has been focusing more on green, on digital and on health BRI and so forth. And this is actually in line with a lot of European priorities as well. So I think there's some policy space there, and that's a matter of political will, whether we do that. I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying there are complications, but I think we also need instruments which go in the direction of collaboration with China, and China still being an important partner. And then last element is on the tech dependency. So if we really want to become more digitally sovereign, or if we want to have more technological autonomy, I mean, if we are serious about that, then we really have to invest a lot of more money, and we need different kinds of instruments. Whatever the European Union has been doing so far hasn't any real effects on our digital autonomy. And so that is something on the level of the Inflation Reduction Act kind of magnitude of measures that needs much more coordination, needs much more thinking, but we are actually just at the beginning of really doing that. And we also have to set priorities. For example, to produce chips which are outdated in the next 2 years in Europe really doesn't make sense as a goal, or to give billions and billions to American or South Korean or Taiwanese chip producing companies to come to Germany and produce something which is maybe outdated in 10 years really doesn't make a lot of sense. So we have to think ahead strategically what's really important. Next generation technologies, for example, 6G. We are already too late for 6G actually, right? There's so much invested already, and the patents are already out there. So we are too late for that, just to give an example. And if we are serious as Europeans in that term, and if we don't want to get basically pushed towards the wall by China and the US, we have to step up our policy instruments. And it's not for our round here to come up, I think, with instruments for that. But this set of instruments also has a huge impact on how the European Union as an international actor can act actually in terms of its own technological capabilities. And I think this is one of the most important elements actually of this strategy, because at the moment we have a double dependency. We are depending on the US for everything from especially platform, cloud, and so forth. We are in a total dependence. And we are in a massive dependence, asymmetrical dependence on China when it comes to ICT products. So whenever these two are going into a real conflict, we will actually suffer most. Not China, not the US, Europe will suffer most because of this double dependency. And so all the talk about digital sovereignty to me is not, I can't take this any longer serious, or it's not really serious talk, because we are not doing anything to resolve that problem, which is adequate to address the gap of capabilities we have there.
Yeah, thanks very much for that very comprehensive overview. Frans-Paul, do you still have something to add to that?
Well, not in terms of instruments. I think all the relevant instruments and have been mentioned. I just would like to add that I think that the most important things for Europe is, on one hand, the military capabilities, but this is a long-term thing. So on the other hand, there is the economic power, the economic influence that Europe has, and that is the basis for a lot of the things that Europe can do if it uses and chooses the right instruments. And for this economic base, for this economic power base of the EU, I think it's important that not to emphasize de-risking and anti-coercion too much. There are a lot of risks in the relationship with China, and it is very important to make sure that we are not in a position that China can use its economic power to coerce European Union or its member states. But there's a danger there that if we overemphasize that we lose the importance of the European ability to remain economically competitive, to focus on innovation in order to strengthen economic competitiveness, which in turn is a requirement for the economic power base. And innovation and focusing on investing in innovation requires, in some cases and to some extent, it requires also Chinese involvement. So I think it's very important not to choose one strategy while at the same time that has a very important defensive aspect, but that in the longer term might weaken Europe's ability to defend its own interests in this world.
Thank you very much for that. And I think that kind of sums it up nicely. I was questioning if I would still want to bring up a last question, but it's dinner time already for most people, or past dinner time. So I think we're gonna wrap it up, and we covered a lot of ground already. So I think this really gave a very good and comprehensive overview of all the issues that are on the table right now in EU Asia relations, with a lot of attention for the role of China in that. Well deserved, I think. So I would like to thank all the participants for joining. That's not always a given on a Monday evening. So great that so many people could join. I would like to thank the partners of the European Strategic Dialogue, so the Cassis Institute at the University of Bonn, the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at the University of Leiden, and the Sirice Institute of the Sorbonne. And last but not least, I would like to thank the speakers, of course, Frans-Paul, Alice, and Maximilian. You did a great job. I thought it was a really great discussion. So we were really happy that you were able to join. Thank you so much, and hopefully we can continue the conversation elsewhere at a different occasion.